The Harwick Bay Cannery had not processed a single fish in 22 years when the Port Authority listed it for sale. It had been built in 1912 by a man named Gideon Alcott, who understood tides and cold and the specific patience required to turn what the ocean gave you into something that would last through a winter on a shelf in a kitchen 1,000 miles from the water. He had built it from Douglas fir and iron and a great deal of practical intelligence, and it had run for 61 years before the salmon runs thinned and the economics of small-batch canneries collapsed, and the Alcott family, by then 2 generations removed from Gideon, closed the doors in the spring of 1980 and walked away without looking back. The Port Authority had held the property since 1991, when the last private owner defaulted on the maintenance assessments. They had listed it once before, 6 years ago, at $1,200 and received no offers. They listed it again in September at $900 with the specific resignation of an institution that has decided something is someone else's problem and is waiting for that someone else to appear. Roland Marsh appeared on a Thursday morning. He was 73 years old. He had spent his career as a marine engineer, 38 years of it, working on the commercial fishing fleet out of ports along the Washington and Oregon coasts, keeping engines running and hulls sound, and the mechanical systems of working vessels in the condition that the sea required, which was perfect, or as close to perfect, as human hands could manage. He had retired 2 years ago, when his left knee informed him that climbing engine room ladders was no longer a reasonable expectation, and he had spent those 2 years in the particular restlessness of a man whose hands know exactly what they are for, and have been told they cannot do it anymore. He had driven past the Harwick Bay Cannery on the coast road every week for 40 years. He had watched it deteriorate with the specific attention of someone who reads structural decay the way other people read faces. He knew the building. He had known it was coming to the end of what neglect would permit. When the Port Authority listing appeared in the Harwick Bay Courier, he read it at the kitchen table with his second cup of coffee, and then he went and found Dot. Dot Marsh was 70 years old. She had spent 31 years as a food preservation scientist at a regional agricultural research station, developing and testing preservation methods for the Pacific Northwest's fishing and farming industries, which meant she understood cold storage, canning chemistry, the science of what happens to organic material when you control temperature and seal it from oxygen, and the specific intelligence required to make something last that was not designed to last. She had retired 18 months ago, and had spent those months doing what she always did when her mind was not occupied with a problem, looking for the next problem. Roland found her in the garden. He handed her the listing without saying anything. She read it once. She looked up at the grey September sky above Harwick Bay. She looked back at the listing. "The cold room," she said. "If it's still there," he said. "A cannery that old, built by someone who knew what they were doing, the cold room will be there," she said. "Whether it's intact is the question." "One way to find out," he said. She handed him back the listing. She pulled off her garden gloves. She went inside to get her coat. They had $940 in their joint account after the month's bills. They drove to the Port Authority office and signed the papers and drove back to Harwick Bay with $900 less and a cannery more, and Dot looking out the passenger window at the grey water of the harbour with the expression Roland had learned to recognize over 44 years of marriage, the expression that meant she was already working on something. They stopped on the way back at the harbour chandlery on Wharf Street, where Roland bought a good marine lantern and a set of inspection tools he needed. Dot bought a box of small glass specimen jars from the shelf near the back of the store, the kind with rubber-sealed lids, the kind you used when you wanted to be sure of what you were keeping. Roland looked at the jars and did not ask. He had been married to Dot Marsh for 44 years, and he understood that she brought the right equipment before she knew what she needed it for. The cannery was at the south end of the harbour, past the working docks, where the road curved around a point of land, and the building came into view below the road, sitting at the water's edge on a concrete foundation that went directly into the tidal zone. It was larger than it looked from the road, long and low, built to follow the contour of the shoreline, its Douglas fir siding weathered to silver grey. The roof was standing seam metal, old but intact on the north face, with a section on the south face that had gone and been covered with a tarpaulin at some point, the tarpaulin now shredded and flapping. The windows were intact, which was more than Roland had hoped. He pulled the truck to the end of the access road, and they sat for a moment looking at it. "The foundation is holding," Roland said. "You can see it in the way the building sits. 22 years and it hasn't shifted." "Concrete over timber piles into the seabed," Dot said. "If they did it right in 1912, it will outlast us." "They did it right," Roland said. "Look at the corner joints." Dot looked. She did not know what he was seeing specifically, but she knew that he was right, because he was always right about structures, and she was always right about what was inside them, and between those two certainties they had managed most of the important decisions of their lives. They got out and walked down to the building. The main entrance was a wide sliding door on iron rails, padlocked with a county lock that the Port Authority key opened. Roland slid the door back on its rails, which moved more smoothly than he expected, the iron rails still greased from whenever someone had last been inside. The smell came out first, cold salt air and old wood and something underneath, something mineral and faintly organic, the smell of a sealed space that had held cold things for a very long time. They stepped inside together. Roland lit the marine lantern. The interior was one large processing space, the floor concrete sloping slightly toward a central drain, the processing equipment still in place along the walls and down the center. The iron and steel of it, dark with oxidation, but present and complete. Conveyor systems, cleaning tables, the canning line, the specific machinery of it, the crimping heads and the fill stations and the label applicator, all seized with rust, but recognizable to anyone who had spent time around working canneries. The equipment had not been removed, because removing it would have cost money that nobody had wanted to spend, which meant that everything that had made this cannery a cannery was still here, seized and dark and waiting. Roland moved through it slowly, his lantern held high, reading the equipment the way he read engines, looking not at what it was, but at what it had done and what it could do again, with the right attention, applied in the right sequence. He crouched at the base of the canning line's drive mechanism and held the lantern close and examined the iron housing, running his thumb along the seam where the housing met the floor mount, feeling for the specific give that indicated a cracked casting or a failed weld. The housing was sound. He moved to the conveyor head and checked the bearing blocks, pressing the lantern close enough to see the grease condition. The bearings were dry, but present. He stood and looked at the ceiling, at the original overhead lighting track, the industrial porcelain fixtures still in their positions, the wiring old, but the conduit intact. He noted all of it in his notebook, with the drawings and annotations of a professional who understands that a detailed record of what a structure is, at the beginning of a project, is the only reliable reference for what it was supposed to become at the end. Dot moved differently. She moved toward the far end of the processing space, where the building deepened slightly, the ceiling lower, the floor transitioning from the processing area to what Roland had told her would be the cold storage section. She was looking at the walls. She was looking at the way the building changed as she moved through it, the specific quality of the air shifting as she approached the far end, cooler and stiller even now. 22 years after the last refrigeration equipment had run, the residual thermal memory of a space that had been engineered to hold cold and had not entirely forgotten how. There was a door at the far end, heavy timber, iron-banded, on iron hinges. It was shut. Dot put her hand flat against the door and held it there, cooler on this side than the processing space behind her, perceptibly cooler, which meant the cold room beyond was still holding something of its original thermal character after 2 decades of abandonment, still functioning at some residual level as the thing it had been designed to be, She tried the handle. It moved. The door swung inward on its iron hinges with the sound of a mechanism that had not been asked to move in a very long time, but had been made well enough to comply when asked. The cold came out around the opening edge, not dramatically, not a rush, but a presence, a breath of something older and more deliberate than the surrounding air. She looked back at Roland. He was at the processing equipment, but he had been watching her with the peripheral awareness he applied to everything in his environment, the attention of someone who has spent his career in spaces where inattention has consequences. He crossed the floor and came to stand beside her. They looked into the cold room together. Roland raised the lantern. The room was perhaps 8 meters by 10. The walls were insulated, the original cork insulation still in place behind wire mesh panels. The shelving along the walls was intact, heavy timber shelving built to hold weight. And on the shelving, on one wall from floor to ceiling, were jars. Not the jars of processed fish they might have expected. These were smaller. Glass, hand-sealed, the lids secured with wire bales, the kind of jar you used for careful work rather than commercial production. There were dozens of them, perhaps 100, each one labeled in a precise hand with small paper tags wired to the necks. The labels bore dates ranging from 1928 to 1951. Each one also bore a name, not a product name, a specimen name. Dot stepped into the cold room. She lifted the lantern to a jar at eye level and read the label. She read the one beside it. She read 3 more along the shelf. "Roland," she said. "I see them," he said. He had followed her in. "These are not food jars," she said. "These are specimen jars, marine specimens. Someone was collecting and preserving marine specimens in the Cannery cold room." He looked at the jars. He looked at the labels. He could not read the specimen names, but he could read the dates, and he could read the care that had gone into the labeling and the sealing and the arrangement of the jars on the shelves, the systematic order of them, the work of someone who was not doing this casually. "Who?" he said. "Gideon Alcott," Dot said. She had found a jar near the end of the shelf, with a different label format, a larger tag, and on it, not a specimen name, but a note in the same precise hand. The note read, "G.H. Alcott, Personal Collection, Tidal Zone Surveys, Harwick Bay to Cape Flattery, begun 1928. "The man who built the Cannery," Roland said. "He was using his own cold room," Dot said. "For 40 years, alongside the commercial operation, he was running a private marine survey, collecting and preserving specimens from the tidal zones of the entire North Washington coast." Roland looked at the jars again. 100 jars, 40 years of systematic collection, in a cold room that had been sealed since 1980. He went back to the main door. On the floor just inside, where it had fallen from some hook or bracket, long since rusted away, was a brass ring, a porthole ring from an old vessel, the kind of hardware that ended up in working harbors, the way driftwood ends up on beaches. He picked it up. He turned it in his hands. He found a nail above the door, an old iron nail, and he hung the ring on it with a loop of wire from his inspection kit. Dot watched him do it. "What's that for?" she said. "Nothing yet," he said. "Something later." He did not know what he meant by that. He just knew the ring belonged above the door of something they had not finished understanding yet. Harwick Bay learned about the purchase before the weekend. The harbour was a community that moved information the way tides moved water, continuously and without particular effort. And by Friday evening the story had passed through the harbour master's office, the chandlery, the Anchor Inn, and the Harwick Bay Cooperative Fisheries, gaining texture at each stop. What the story gained at each stop was a specific kind of texture, the texture of collective certainty. The cannery had been a problem for 22 years. Everyone in Harwick Bay understood this in the specific way that harbour communities understand the condition of their waterfront, personally, continuously, with a running calculation of what each property's state cost the rest of them in appearance and opportunity. A retired marine engineer and his wife had paid $900 for it. This was either generous or foolish, depending on who you asked, and the consensus in the harbour by Friday evening was that it was probably both. Port Commissioner Vern Hadley heard it at the cooperative on Friday morning. He was a thick-shouldered man in his late 60s who had managed the Harwick Bay Port Authority for 14 years with the specific confidence of someone who believed he understood the harbour's assets better than anyone else in it. He listened to the account of the sale with the expression of a man hearing about a situation he has already categorized. He addressed it at the following Tuesday's Port Authority meeting in public session, with 3 other commissioners present and a gallery of harbour community members who attended these meetings out of habit and civic engagement. He noted that the Cannery property had been a port liability for over 2 decades and expressed his concern that the new owners, a retired marine engineer and his wife, lacked the resources and institutional capacity to improve the situation in any meaningful way. He recommended the Commission prepare a structural assessment request and set a remediation timeline of 90 days. He said all of this with the comfortable authority of a man who had not been inside the cannery in 14 years and did not intend to be. The gallery received it with the quiet agreement of people who have not been inside the cannery either, but have driven past it enough times to feel entitled to an opinion about it. Roland and Dot were in the gallery. They listened to all of it. They did not respond. They drove back to the cannery from the meeting, and Roland looked at the roof situation in the remaining afternoon light, and Dot went back into the cold room and continued her catalogue where she had left off the day before. This was their response. Not words. Work. Faye called on Saturday. She was their younger child, 40 years old, a landscape architect in Portland who loved her parents in the specific anxious way of someone who has spent her whole adult life calculating what things cost. "Dad," she said, when Roland answered. "The cannery." "The Harwick Bay Cannery, yes," Roland said. "You bought it." "Your mother and I bought it," Roland said. $900. You spent almost everything you have." "We have $40 and a cannery," Roland said, "and your mother has already identified what she thinks is a systematic marine specimen collection in the cold room that may predate any formal Pacific Northwest tidal survey by 20 years. A silence. Then Faye said, "She found what?" "Ask your mother," Roland said. "She explains it better." Owen called the following day. He was their older child, 43, a fisheries manager in Juneau, which meant he had opinions about canneries and about the Washington coast and about retired people making significant financial decisions. He expressed these opinions at some length. Roland listened with the patience of a man who has spent 44 years listening to engines that had opinions about being operated and has learned that the noise is usually not the whole story. "Come and see it before you decide what it is," Roland said finally. Owen said he would think about it. Roland said that was fine. They started work on Monday. Roland arrived at the cannery at first light with his inspection tools and a systematic plan that he had written in his notebook over the weekend, the plan of a marine engineer who has assessed vessels in distress for 38 years and knows that the difference between what can be saved and what cannot is almost always a question of sequence. You addressed the structural envelope first, then the mechanical systems, then everything else. You did not skip ahead because you were impatient or because something interesting was waiting at the other end of the sequence. You did it in order because the order was the reason it worked. The roof on the south face was the first priority. The shredded tarpaulin was removed and the extent of the damage assessed. It was not as bad as it looked from below. 3 meters of standing seam had separated from the ridge cap and curled back in a winter storm at some point, exposing the deck beneath, and the deck had taken water damage, but the rafters beneath it were sound. The Douglas fir that Gideon Alcott had built with in 1912 was old-growth timber, the kind that was no longer available for new construction, dense and tight-grained, and resistant to the rot that lesser wood would have surrendered to years ago. Roland ran his hand along a rafter and felt the specific density of it, and thought that whoever had done the original work had understood what a building in a coastal tidal environment needed to withstand. He sourced matching standing seam material from a marine supplier in Port Angeles and spent 3 days on the roof in the grey October weather, working alone at heights that his left knee found opinionated, but that his hands and his 38 years of professional discipline found entirely manageable. He worked with the methodical precision of someone for whom the difference between a job done right and a job done well enough is not a philosophical question, but a professional one. Every seam properly locked, every ridge cap properly seated, every fastener properly driven. The roof would not fail again in his lifetime, which was the standard Roland Marsh applied to all work he put his name on. When the roof was done, he moved to the foundation, checking the concrete at the tidal interface for the specific deterioration patterns that salt water and freeze-thaw cycling produce over decades. The foundation was in better condition than he had any right to expect. Gideon Alcott, or someone after him, had used a maritime-grade concrete mix at the waterline, the kind that incorporated specific aggregates to resist chloride penetration, a choice that in 1912 would have been a deliberate and informed decision rather than a standard specification. The man had known what he was doing at every scale. Roland documented everything in his notebook with the drawings of a professional, plan views and section details and annotations, the specific language of someone who has spent his career making sure that what he understood about a structure was communicable to anyone who needed to understand it after him. Dot worked below while he worked above and alongside him and ahead of him in the cold room where she was building something he could not help with and would not try to rush. She had returned to the cold room on the first morning with her specimen jars from the chandlery and her notebook and her reading glasses and begun the work of cataloguing what was there. She worked with cotton gloves, handling each of Gideon Alcott's jars with the care of a preservation scientist who understands that the contents of a sealed jar are a conversation between the moment of collection and the present, a conversation that can be ended by carelessness and that cannot be restarted once it is broken. She read the labels. She made notes. She cross-referenced the specimen names against the reference texts she had brought from home. The Pacific Northwest marine biology references she had used in her research career, working through them methodically, the way she had always worked through a new collection, establishing the known before looking for the unknown. Most of what Gideon Alcott had collected was identifiable and documented. Limpets and chitons and sea stars and the small crustaceans of the intertidal zone, collected with evident purpose across 23 years of systematic effort, labeled with dates and locations, and in several cases with behavioral observations written in his small, precise hand on separate paper tags tucked into the wire bail of the jar. He had been paying attention to things that most people walked past without looking at. He had been doing it since 1928, and he had not stopped until the jars stopped, which was 1951, 6 years before Gideon Alcott died at the age of 78, according to the harbour records Roland found in the Port Authority file. The collection had its own internal logic, as all careful collections do, and it became visible to Dot over the first 2 weeks of work, the logic of a mind that moved systematically from the common to the uncommon, building a baseline of the known in order to make the unknown legible when it appeared. Gideon Alcott had been a self-taught naturalist working without institutional support or academic affiliation, and he had applied to his work the same practical intelligence he applied to running a commercial cannery, methodically, patiently, with the understanding that what you found was only as useful as the record you made of it. On the 4th day, she found the jar that changed everything. It was on the 3rd shelf from the bottom, toward the middle of the collection, in a position that suggested Gideon Alcott had known exactly where it belonged in his system, not at the beginning where the common specimens were, not at the end where the rarest were, but in the middle, where things went when they were uncommon enough to be notable, but not so rare as to be isolated. The label read, Cryptochiton stellari, juvenile specimen, collected Harwick Bay intertidal zone, October 1944. Gumboot chiton, a large tidal invertebrate, common in the Pacific Northwest, unremarkable in a collection of this kind. But beside it, pressed close against it on the shelf, as if Gideon Alcott had wanted to keep them together, was a smaller jar. The label on the smaller jar read, C. stellari variant, coloration atypical, shell plate structure anomalous, possible separate species, second specimen of this type collected, first collected August 1941. Dot set the jar down on the work table very carefully. She sat back on her stool. She read the label again from the beginning. She read it a third time. A variant noted and labelled with professional precision by a self-taught naturalist in a commercial Cannery cold room in 1941. A second specimen of the same type, collected 3 years later, the collector noting that it was his second, which meant he had recognized it immediately when he found it again, which meant he had been looking for it. The language on the label was not the language of someone who had found something interesting by accident. It was the language of someone who had been paying close attention to a specific thing for 3 years and had just found confirmation of what they had suspected. Possible separate species. Gideon Alcott had written that in 1944, and then he had sealed the jar and put it on the shelf and continued his work, and eventually died, and the door had closed. She went to her reference texts. She searched methodically, the way she had been trained to search, starting with the most specific and working outward. She found nothing that matched the description in the North Washington Coast literature published after 1944. She searched the pre-war literature, the surveys conducted in the 20s and 30s. She found one reference that was close but not identical. She found a single line in a 1958 Pacific Northwest Marine Biology journal, a parenthetical note in a survey paper, observing that a potentially distinct chiton species had been recorded in Harwick Bay intertidal surveys in the early 1940s, but had not been documented since, and was assumed to have been a misidentification or an anomalous individual. It was not a misidentification. It was not an anomalous individual. There were 2 of them in jars on the 3rd shelf from the bottom, preserved in the specific cold of a room that had kept them intact for 80 years, labelled in the careful hand of a man who had understood what he was looking at and had done everything a person without institutional affiliation could do to make sure someone else would eventually understand it too. She went and found Roland on the roof. He climbed down when he saw her face. She had a specific expression she made when she had found something important in a collection, a stillness, a quality of controlled certainty, and he had learned to recognize it in 31 years of watching her work. He had not seen it in 18 months. He saw it now. She told him what she had found. He listened the way he listened to everything, completely and without interruption, his eyes on her face. When she finished, he looked at the cold room door for a moment, and then he looked at the harbour beyond the Cannery windows, the grey water moving in the October afternoon, the tidal zone below the building, accessible now at low tide, the specific zone where Gideon Alcott had made his collections 80 years ago. "You're telling me there might be a species in that jar that nobody has documented properly," he said. "I'm telling you there is a specimen in that jar that was collected twice by the same careful observer 3 years apart and specifically noted as potentially distinct and never followed up," Dot said. "Whether it constitutes a separate species requires a marine biologist with the right equipment and the right credentials. What I can tell you is that the man who made this collection knew what he was doing, and he knew what he was looking at, and he left us a very precise record of both." Roland looked at the cold room door. He looked at the porthole ring he had hung on its nail above the door on the first morning, the brass gone green at the edges, the wire holding it steady. "All right," he said. "All right what?" she said. "All right, we find a marine biologist," he said, "and we make sure those jars are safe while we do." If you have made it this far into Roland and Dot Marsh's story, hit subscribe, because what comes next is the part I have been waiting to tell you. The woman who appeared at the Cannery on a Wednesday morning in November was 24 years old and drove a truck with a university permit on the dash and enough equipment in the bed to suggest she had not planned on a short visit. Her name was Suki Tanaka, and she was a marine biology doctoral student from the University of Washington, doing tidal zone surveys along the North Washington coast as part of her dissertation research. She had a list of sites and a schedule, and Harwick Bay was on both. She had parked on the coast road and walked around the point to access the intertidal area below the Cannery, and found the Cannery gate open and Roland inside working on the processing equipment with a grinder, the sound of it carrying out to the water. She had stopped. She had looked at the building. She had come inside, because whatever was happening in this building was not what she had expected from the county records that listed it as abandoned. She had planned to apologize for the intrusion and continue to the tidal zone. She did not continue to the tidal zone that morning. She stayed for 6 hours. Roland brought her to Dot. Dot looked at her for a moment with the specific assessment of a scientist meeting another scientist, reading her equipment and her notebook and the particular quality of attention she was already giving the cold room before she had been invited into it. "You study tidal invertebrates," Dot said. It was not a question. "Chiton populations specifically," Suki said. Dot opened the cold room door and stepped back. Suki stepped inside. She moved along the shelves, reading labels for 5 minutes without speaking. Then she stopped at a jar and bent close to read the label without touching the glass. "This collection is systematic," she said. 47 years of systematic collection," Dot said. 1928 to 1975. "Who made it?" "The man who built the Cannery," Dot said. "A commercial fisherman and self-taught naturalist named Gideon Alcott. No institutional affiliation. No publication record. He was simply paying attention." Suki straightened. She looked at Dot. "For 47 years. For 47 years," Dot said. "And then he died, and the Cannery closed, and the door stayed shut." Dot showed her the anomalous variant jar last, setting it on the cold room work table, under the best light they had, a work lamp Roland had run from the main electrical panel he had restored the previous week. Suki looked at it for a long time without touching it. She looked at the label. She looked at the specimen in the jar, the preserved liquid still clear enough after decades to make the specimen visible. She looked at the date. She looked at the note about the first specimen collected 3 years earlier. Then she said, in a voice she was working to keep professionally level, "Where exactly in the Harwick Bay intertidal zone was this collected?" Dot told her what the label said and what Roland had found in the Port Authority file about Gideon Alcott's collection boat. Suki set down her notebook. She picked it up again. She said, "I need to tell you something." What she told them was this: a chiton variant, matching the description on Gideon Alcott's label, had been observed twice in the past 4 years by tidal zone researchers at 2 separate institutions, both times in the North Washington coast, both times noted and flagged, and not followed up with formal documentation, because a single field observation without a type specimen was not sufficient to open a formal inquiry into a potentially new species. She was one of the researchers who had made one of those observations. She had made it 14 months ago, in the Harwick Bay intertidal zone, directly below where they were standing. She had come back to Harwick Bay to look again. She had found the Cannery instead, and in the Cannery she had found 2 type specimens collected 80 years ago by a man who had understood what he was looking at, but had not had the institutional language to make anyone else understand it. Roland looked at Dot. Dot looked at Roland. The cold room was still and dry around them, and outside the window, the Harwick Bay tidal zone moved in the November grey, indifferent and alive. The trouble came 3 weeks after Suki's first visit, in the form of a letter from the University of Washington's Marine Biology Department. It was addressed to Roland and Dot, and it was courteous and thorough, and it made a formal request for the transfer of Gideon Alcott's specimen collection to the university's preservation facilities in Seattle, citing the collection's scientific significance and the university's superior capacity for long-term preservation and analysis. Roland read it twice at the kitchen table. Dot read it once. "No," Dot said. "No," Roland agreed. The letter was the beginning of 2 months of what Roland described to Owen. When Owen finally came to Harwick Bay in December and stood in the cold room looking at the jars with the expression of a fisheries manager encountering something that exceeded his professional categories, as a polite and sustained argument with people who were right about the science and wrong about the conclusion. The university was correct that their facilities were superior to what Roland and Dot could maintain in the Cannery cold room. Dot did not dispute this. What she disputed was the premise that superior facilities were the primary consideration when deciding where a collection of this nature belonged. The collection had been made in Harwick Bay by a Harwick Bay man across 4 decades of patient local observation. The species it documented lived in the Harwick Bay intertidal zone and had lived there continuously for the entire period of documented human presence in the harbour. The community of Harwick Bay had a claim on this collection that a university facility in Seattle did not possess, and the transfer of the specimens to Seattle would permanently sever the relationship between the collection and the place that had produced it, a severance that no amount of institutional quality could undo. She said all of this in a letter that took her 4 days to write, and that Roland read in draft form 3 times, not because it needed his editing, but because she wanted him to understand exactly what she was arguing and why. Roland contributed 2 paragraphs on the structural capacity of the improved cold room, written with the engineering specificity of someone who has produced technical documentation for marine classification societies and knows what rigorous means. The combined letter was 11 pages. It was the most thorough document either of them had produced since their respective retirements, and it showed. The university's response took 3 weeks and was notably shorter than their original letter. It proposed a formal collaborative arrangement. The collection would remain in Harwick Bay. The university would provide preservation consultation, equipment, and calibration services at no cost to Roland and Dot. Suki's doctoral dissertation would be formally centered on the Harwick Bay intertidal zone and the Alcott collection, with the collection credited as the primary source. The species, when formally confirmed as distinct, would be named with the Alcott collection as the type specimen source, which meant the name would carry Gideon Alcott's work into the scientific literature permanently. Roland read the response letter at the kitchen table. Then he read it again. "That's what we wanted," he said. "That's most of what we wanted," Dot said. She was already making notes on what the preservation consultation would need to cover. Owen stood in the cold room in December and said very little for a long time. Then he said, "Gideon Alcott was doing this for 47 years, and nobody knew." "He knew," Roland said. Owen looked at the jars. He was a fisheries manager. He understood tidal zones and specimen collection and the specific discipline required to do systematic biological survey work over decades without institutional support or recognition. He understood, standing in this cold room that smelled of cold salt air and old preservative and Douglas fir timber, what it meant to spend the better part of a working life paying attention to something because you believed it mattered, with no audience and no academic affiliation, and no guarantee that anyone would ever agree with you. "I should have come sooner," Owen said. "You came," Roland said. "That's the thing." Fay came in January and brought her notebook, which Roland had not expected, and which pleased him more than he could easily say. She spent 2 hours with Dot in the cold room, asking specific questions about the preservation chemistry and the cataloguing methodology, and she spent an hour with Roland examining the structural work he had done. And before she left, she said that she had been wrong to worry. Roland received this with the grace of a father who had expected no less and was glad to have it confirmed out loud. The Cannery opened to the community on the first Saturday in March, which was also the Saturday closest to the date in 1928, when Gideon Alcott had made his first collection entry in the cold room ledger that Dot had found behind the specimen jars. The cold room was preserved and open to visitors by appointment. The processing floor had been partially restored, enough to show the original equipment in its working arrangement, enough to tell the story of what the building had been before it became what it was now. Suki's ongoing research operated out of a small workroom Roland had framed and finished in the rear of the building over the winter, the university's consultation equipment installed and running. Word had moved through Harwick Bay in the weeks before the opening, with the efficiency of a harbour community receiving genuinely unexpected news. The courier piece had run 2 weeks before the public opening and had been, by Harwick Bay standards, widely read and specifically discussed. People who had driven past the Cannery for 20 years without thinking much about it found themselves thinking about it. People who had known Gideon Alcott, or known people who had known him, found those memories becoming suddenly relevant in a way they had not been for decades. The harbour master came to the opening with his wife and 2 of his dock crew. A man named Terence Birch, who had worked the Cannery as a teenager in its last years of operation, came and stood in the processing space for a long time, looking at the equipment he had once worked beside, and then found Dot and told her things about how the floor had been organized in operation that she had not been able to reconstruct from the equipment alone, specific things about workflow and timing and the particular rhythm of a working cannery day that added texture to the restoration that no document could have provided. A woman named Gloria Hadwick, 81 years old, came with her son and told Roland that her father had known Gideon Alcott and had talked about the jars in the cold room, that Gideon had shown her father the collection once, decades ago, and that her father had described it as the most extraordinary thing he had ever seen in a building that made canned salmon. Nobody had believed her father. Nobody had asked questions. The cold room door had been closed, and the jars had been on the other side of it, and eventually everyone who had known about them had died or forgotten, and the knowing had simply stopped. She stood in the cold room doorway and looked at the jars on the shelves. She put her hand over her mouth. Then she removed it and said, in a steady voice, "My father was right." "He was," Dot said. Vern Hadley came in the afternoon when the crowd had thinned, the way people come to things when they want to arrive without making an entrance. He walked through the processing floor with his hands in his coat pockets, looking at the equipment, looking at Roland's structural work on the ceiling and the walls, looking at the cold room, with the expression of a man who had not been inside this building in 14 years and was revising a considerable number of assumptions in real time. He found Dot at the work table. "I said something at the commission meeting," he said, "about institutional capacity." "I was in the gallery," Dot said. "You had the capacity," he said. "I was wrong about that." Dot looked at him with the level attention she applied to all materials, assessing what was honest in it and what was performed. She found it honest enough. "Come and look at the variant jar," she said. "I'll show you what Gideon Alcott saw in 1941 that nobody else saw for 80 years. He came and looked. She showed him. He was quiet for a long time afterward, looking at the jar on the 3rd shelf, and Roland, who was at the doorway, watched Vern Hadley's face do the specific work of a man revising a category he had held with confidence for a long time. It was not a comfortable process to watch. It was an honest one. In the evening, when the cannery was quiet and the last visitors had gone, Roland and Dot walked through it together in the low March light. The cold room was closed but not locked. The processing floor gleamed where Roland had cleaned and treated the concrete. The equipment stood in its original positions, dark iron against pale walls, the specific arrangement of a place that had known what it was for. They stopped at the main door. Above it, on its nail, the brass porthole ring hung where Roland had put it on the first day, a loop of wire holding it to the iron nail, the brass dark with age and greenish at the edges with verdigris. Roland looked at it. He reached up and took it down. He turned it in his hands the way he had turned it on the first morning, the specific weight of old brass, the diameter of a porthole from a vessel that no longer existed. He handed it to Dot. She held it at arm's length and looked through it at the cold room door beyond, the way you look through a porthole at what is on the other side of the hull. Gideon Alcott spent 40 years looking at something nobody else could see, she said. And left it here for someone who could, Roland said. She handed the ring back. He hung it on the nail above the door. It caught the last of the March light through the window at the end of the processing floor and held it, the way brass holds light, warmly and without effort. That was what $900 had bought. Not the building exactly. The building was what they had paid for. What they had bought was the chance to be the people who finally looked. I want to know what this story gave you. Leave it in the comments. What you felt standing in that cold room when Dot found the label on the third shelf from the bottom, whatever it stirred in you. It belongs there and I want to read it. Tell me where you are watching from today. This story began in a cannery on the Washington coast, and it has found you wherever you are, and I want to know where that is. And I want to ask you something this story left me thinking about. Has there ever been someone in your life who spent decades paying attention to something that nobody else thought was worth paying attention to, and turned out to be right? A person who kept the record when nobody asked them to. Tell me who that person was. This community holds those stories with the care they deserve. Thank you for being here for Roland and Dot. The next story is already waiting, and I think it is going to stay with you.